Hello, Culture Matters podcast. I am very excited to introduce you to our guest. Before I do that, here's a quote just for this episode. The higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly. Friedrich Nietzsche. Our guest today is not only a commentator, is not only a strategist and a thinker and a consigliere to various leaders of the world throughout their tenured career. 36 years serving our U.S. military, 34 and a half years active, 16 countries at least. Colonel Chris Wyatt, founder and CEO of Indaba Africa Group, consultant, advisor, teacher as well, which we'll talk about, African studies, and so much more. Linguist, I got to learn about that. Six, at least, languages, counterintelligence, counterterrorism. Thank you so much for coming on the Culture Matters podcast. And I have to admit, I've been preparing and I'm like sweating. I'm just nervous because your mind, you're so fast and just brilliant, brilliant man. Shout out to Rob Herzog for introducing us. What a gift he's been. So thanks for coming on the Culture Matters podcast. And I'm excited to learn from you today.
Well, Jay, thanks a lot. It's my pleasure to be here. But I would submit it's not nervousness talking to me making you sweat. It's that sweater you're wearing, dude. It's springtime. Drop the sweater. It's time to switch back to t-shirts, okay?
Yeah. Now you sound like Jenna this morning. She's like, "Hey, put this in." No, I want to wear the sweater. So I first I'd like to dive into um, South Africa's was subject matter expertise in the beginning of your career. Is that correct? Or did that come as a consequence of what you were doing in Germany and even before that? Like, where did that? Because there's so many places, there's multiple continents, obviously, there's hundreds of countries. So why there?
Well, Jay, the South Africa aspect's a bit of a long story. I'll try to keep the Reader's Digest condensed version so that your audience stays interested. But when I was a kid in the 70s, I didn't have much in the way of any resources, kind of poor, and at one point lived in abject poverty. And one thing I did have was going to the library at school. So I would go to the library and look at atlases and gazetteers. And at the time, I'd be like, oh, San Marino, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, look at these postage stamp countries. They look so fascinating. I want to go there. I want to go there. Well, I didn't have any money to travel. So I dreamt of those places. But at the same time this was happening, we had liberation movements from the colonial era ending in Africa, in particular in Southern Africa, Angola, Mozambique, Rhodesia. And then South Africa was also had this apartheid government that was led by a minority population of white South Africans. So what happened is I read a book by James Michener in the late 1970s, or it might have been 1980. I don't remember exactly when it came out, but I was able to get a paperback. I think they're like $1.99 or $2.99 back then for a paperback. 1,200 pages of fine print. And if you know Michener, he wrote historical fiction. He takes a real place and a real topic, and he just elaborates on it. But the thing about Michener is he starts when the earth is formed, so you got to be patient for the first few chapters. And eventually he takes real people, historical figures, and fake characters that he narrates, and he puts it in the interweave and how world events unfold. I read him. He had a mini series that was done on television called Centennial back in the 70s, and I just that really got me into Michener. And so I started reading everything he wrote. I never really read Hawaii, which was his first big novel after the Second World War, because he served in the Second World War. But he wrote Hawaii, Texas, Poland, space, Chesapeake, one of my favorites because I'm from the Chesapeake Bay area originally. And then he wrote a book called The Covenant, which was about South Africa. And the Covenant was an agreement made by the Trek Boers, the pioneers of South Africa, the white pioneers, who made an agreement, a pact with God that if he delivered them in this battle, they were about to face 10 to 20,000 Zulu warriors. There are only 460 of these white pioneers. If they survived this, they would build a church in his honor. And the Afrikaans word for that is gelofte. That's the pact. And so the covenant. So they made a covenant with God. They would build a church. And they won the battle. And nobody died, but a lot of Zulus died, thousands of them. And the battle became known as Blood River. Well, I read that book and I became fascinated. I said to myself, wow, South Africa, what a crazy, fascinating, screwed up country this is. Bear in mind, this is during the height of apartheid, okay, around 1980. And I was in high school at this point. So I was already interested in South Africa. Then I went to university as a freshman at the age of 17 in 1982. And on a Friday, I was introduced by one of the upperclassmen at one of our ROTC labs. He said, "You coming to the game tonight?" I said, "The game's tomorrow." He said, "No, not football, man, rugby." I said, "Look, I'm from Appalachia. we just got paved roads and electricity. We don't have rugby. I said, I've heard of it, but I've never watched. He goes, it'll be fun. You'll love it. I said, okay, fine. He's a nice guy. So I went down there and it was fantastic. I saw rugby for the first time. It was club level, played on the band fields at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, down by the Hocking River. And like, this is a cool game. So I kind of fell in love with the game right there on the spot, but we didn't play rugby in America. There was no major sports leagues. It wasn't a professional sport. So I started looking as a history student, who can I support since we didn't have a U.S. national team? And I looked at England, France, New Zealand, Australia. I have kind of this interest in Africa already, and South Africa as a team. It's a famous team. So I became a Springbok fan. And that's where the interest in South Africa started building from there. So I after a year of partying and not focusing on studies, now I say partying, not drinking and doing drugs, but just not being responsible. Just, that's hanging out, going to events and not really paying attention to my studies. After a year, I realized I was wasting my time and other people's money because I was on grant money and student loans and stuff like that. So I decided to go in the Army and get money for college, went in the Army and hoped to accomplish a few things, one of which was to finish my degree or get money for college, and then also take college classes at night and weekends if I could. And I did. I managed to get an associate's degree on active duty, come back to Ohio University, fix my GPA because I was on academic probation, and graduate with honors. But when I was at Ohio University, I focused my studies on Africa for history and specifically Southern Africa because that appealed to me. And at this point, by the late 1980s, apartheid was reaching its apex and the Cold War was coming to an end and it was all going to change. In 89 is when it all changed right after I graduated. Wow. So the Berlin Wall came down and the whole world changed in so many ways, including Africa. So the one more piece to this is that in the mid 1980s, when I was stationed in Germany, I learned German and I became fluent in German very quickly as a second language. German's not the easiest language to learn, but I learned that when you learn a foreign language, people think differently in the way they construct their language. So learning culture and learning about a people, after I learned German, 84, by the end of 84, I was relatively fluent in it, certainly in bar speak to hang around with, meet ladies, but then I started taking classes at the University of Maryland at night to learn the grammar. So when I did that, I realized that if I want to understand South African apartheid and the Afrikaner people, the white population, part of the white population there, it might be smart of me to try to learn Afrikaans. And the thing is that if you were learning Afrikaans in the 1980s, the first question you got asked is, what are you, a racist? No, I'm not a racist. I'm just curious about the language. I want to understand these people. And oh, by the way, why are you asking if I'm a racist? Do you realize that most of the people who speak the language as a first language aren't even white? They're actually mixed race and brown and people. Anyway, so I started self-teaching myself Afrikaans because Afrikaans is a language that developed initially off of Dutch when the Dutch settled South Africa, and then it's mixed with 6 other sources of languages which contributed from South Asia because they brought slaves in from Indonesia and South Asia, and they became part of the population there, and plus some African languages. So there's 7 source origins for the language itself. It's the newest language in the world, and actually it's the only language in the world that has a monument dedicated to it. It's called the Tau Monument, the Language Monument, which is located in Pearl, which is Pearl in English, in the Western Cape of South Africa. So I started self-teaching myself Afrikaans, and if you know German and you know English, you can learn Dutch. Now, speaking, it's 2 different things. I mean, I remember once upon a time I was at Soesterberg Air Base in the early 1990s in the Netherlands when we still had an air base for American troops up there. And I came out of the shower and I turned the TV on and a Dutch news program was on. And there was the most beautiful woman I've ever seen in my entire life. She was on television as an announcer. The gentleman was talking and I'm listening and he's speaking. And I'm like, I'm just entranced in how beautiful she is. And then she started talking. No. Anyway, the point of the story is that it can be brutal to pronounce. Okay, so I don't pretend to speak Afrikaans. In fact, usually when people ask me if I speak Afrikaans, the phrase I use is "Ik praat nie Afrikaans nie, maar ek verstaan," which means I don't speak it, but I understand it because I can't understand the language. So
In that late 80s time, the Berlin Wall comes down. It's all, what was the opportunity at that time, or as well as what were some of the fears and perceived risks geopolitically that you were kind of enmeshed in?
well, I was just coming back out of university. Keep that in mind. I'm at the young, in my early 20s or mid 20s. I'm a second lieutenant coming back in the Army as an intelligence professional. And we were taught and focused on the Soviet threat, the Soviet Union. And then as soon as I got to my first unit, there's no Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin. What are we doing here? And the world struggled with where it was going to go. The Clinton administration struggled geopolitically. They came up with a national security strategy called an engagement and enlargement, which was meant to engage more of the world. I'm not going to fault them for their idea. I appreciate where they're coming from, but it didn't really work out that way. And the world kind of stumbled. But I had a vision. In 1984, Jay, when I was a private sitting in the education center in Bad Kreuznach, Germany. I was sitting there and I looked down and there was this pamphlet. And it was off to the side. Now, this isn't it. This is from an event last night. I'm just grabbing a pamphlet here. But I looked at this pamphlet and it said the Army Foreign Area Officer Program. Now, bear in mind, I'm what, 1984. I'm not even 20 years old, right? I'm sitting there and I'm a private in the Army trying to sign up for college class. And it says, in the Army Foreign Area Officer Program, you become a regional specialist. And once you become a major, you go and you work as an attaché, or you work on a staff as an officer for preparing programs, or you work as an intelligence officer, or you work as security assistant. I'm like, this is interesting. And this is what you get from the program. We send you to a fully funded postgraduate program. Ooh, okay, you got my attention. And where is it? Oh, Columbia, Yale, Harvard, Wisconsin, Madison. Oh,
Wow.
that sounds pretty cool. We send you to school for language for a year. Oh, okay, that sounds cool. And then we send you for basically an internship where you work in an embassy abroad. I'm like, hey, this is for me. So in 1984, sitting in an education center, I made a life plan that I followed. Now, there are bumps and turns and twists along the road. Things happen. But I decided in 1984 as a private that I wanted to finish my enlistment, go back to university, graduate, become a military intelligence officer for regular Army, which is hard to get because there's only a small number of actual regular Army officers that are
Hmm.
permanent officers. The rest are reservists on active duty. A regular Army, military intelligence, and when it was time, become a foreign area officer for sub-Saharan Africa. Made that decision in 1984. I wanted to make full colonel, which was almost impossible in that career field. Out of 72,000 officers in the U.S. Army, only 18 colonels did the job that I did. 18.
Wow.
So,
Holy
so,
cow.
so I'm, and at the time I made that decision, there were only 12 in the 1980s. So I was trying to aspire to be one of 12 out of an organization at the time that had 800,000 people on active duty in the 1980s, and then be the defense attaché in South Africa. All of that came true, Jay, except the defense attaché, because when I pinned on full colonel, put my Eagles on, the Army or the U.S. Africa Command, for whatever reason, decided to hand that billet over to the Navy. It had been Air Force, it had been Army, then Air Force, and then went back to the Army, and they gave it to the Navy. Well, I'm not in the Navy, so it's a Navy captain because they thought that was more important to have a Navy relationship. So I couldn't do that. And also, it's a question of timing. You have to be available when that person, that vacancy comes up. So all of those things came true and much more. I had no idea that I'd rebuild the Armed Forces Library in post-conflict Africa. I had no idea that I'd be responsible for designing the intelligence infrastructure for the Botswana Defense Force. So there were so many cool things. I had no idea that I'd run HIV programs. Who ever even heard of HIV in 1984? We just discovered that was the cause of AIDS. So all these things that happened. It was really cool. I really enjoyed my experience, and I've tried to turn that into something positive.
Were there you were teaching in Iowa before you went to Liberia, correct?
Yes, I taught at Iowa State in the mid 1990s. After I came back from Germany, I was sent off to teach at Iowa State University for 2 years, and I went to Liberia several years after that.
Were there things you picked up in teaching that ended up helping when you integrated into that that culture?
Not so much. The university teaching was teaching ROTC, so teaching military science. So that didn't really play a role. But while at Iowa State University, my boss, the professor of military science, insisted that I try to do a postgraduate program. But Iowa State University is an engineering school. It's not really focused on international relations or politics. They do have some liberal arts programs. So what I did is I created a program for myself to do a master's degree. And my program was focused on skill sets that most Army officers don't have, and I thought it would be unique. Turns out it was. So I took three disciplines. I took community and regional planning. I mean, how many conservatives are people who've done postgraduate work in community and regional planning? That's usually blue-haired leftists that like to do that. So I have background in that. I also took international political economy, which was fantastic to understand global economics much better, and different programs. And then finally, I took cultural anthropology, which appeals to me greatly.
Mm,
That's the cultural aspect. So I put those three pieces together, and my thesis that I developed was on the housing subsidy program in South Africa. Bear in mind that 1995, it's a brand new South Africa. We just had the elections in April of 94, and the new ANC government is in a coalition with the former minority white-led party that's now part of the government. And so they're moving forward. They created a housing subsidy program to deliver a grant to people so they could build houses or buy a house. Unfortunately, from my perspective, they did it based on income. And the unique nature of South Africa meant that was the wrong approach, in my view. Let me explain. So in South Africa at that time, many hundreds of thousands of people who were married weren't living with their wives. They were off in the gold fields or the platinum fields mining, and their families lived back in a village somewhere. And so the family has two or three kids living in a remote area in KwaZulu-Natal, while the husband's up near Johannesburg mining gold. Well, a lot of those husbands are sleeping with prostitutes or have girlfriends and, and they're spending all their money drinking. They don't need a house. They just need a room because they're up there, working. But the wife has three kids. She needs space for them. She's got a teenage daughter, two sons. So I came up with a very complicated formula, doing something I hope never to do again in my life, and that's regression analysis. Oh, I hate that. I hate that. And
Wow.
I came up with a formula for allocating who should get a housing subsidy based on need, not based on income. Anyway, my major professor unfortunately died. I was sent away from my assignment early, and I never defended my thesis. So, so I did all the work.
Wow.
And so that's ABD at Iowa State. That was my first postgraduate program. So that's how the Iowa experience tied to what I did in Liberia.
How did that prepare you for Liberia then, if at all? That sounds like it would.
Well, it did. Also, my experience growing up all over America and going to dozens of primary and junior high schools. Before the age 17, I lived in, I think, 34 of the lower 48 states.
Wow.
Yeah. So that experience as a youth growing up, always being the new kid, the skinny kid on the block, being on the outside, trying to fit in, made me in many ways kind of a chameleon, able to adapt to my environment. And then the cultural anthropology studies that I did postgraduate work kind of played into that role. Plus, I'd already lived overseas in Europe and traveled all over Europe. All those experiences came together to help me empathize with people and see the other. The other being
Mm.
a different skin color, a different faith, a different gender, whatever. So I think I have a strong ability to empathize with others, and that played a role. So in Liberia, I got where people were coming from. I understood the motivations, even if they weren't legitimate or honest motivations. I understand where they're coming from most of the time. So it really helped me understand the culture of Liberia. One thing about Americans that go to Liberia, since we're talking about Liberia, and they don't get that Liberia is not America because Liberians always play it up as if they're American because the country was founded by freed slaves and freed blacks who went to Liberia in the 19th century. So Liberians have this strong tie to America, but America doesn't have a strong tie to Liberia, and Liberians think it does. So a lot of Americans will visit there and they think, oh, this is like being in America. Well, it's not. Let me give you just one anecdotal cultural
Yeah.
example of why it's important. So if you're in Liberia and somebody says, where are you from? So I'm going to ask you, Jay, where are you from?
New Jersey.
Okay, where are you at right now? You're not in New Jersey, are you?
No, I'm in a hotel in
Okay,
Pittsburgh.
So I
But
know
I'm
that
sure
I
I
know that
moved
you're
about as much as you as young, so I always
sound
have a hard time answering that.
well. Let me, but same here. I mean, I was born in Maryland, but I live all over the country. But so knowing that you're in Pittsburgh, if I were to ask you right now, I'm going to ask you again, and I'll show you, and you're going to laugh. Okay, so Jay, okay, so you're in Pittsburgh. So I'm asking you, where are you from?
New Jersey?
Are you tired? Was I really? That's because when you ask someone in Liberia, where are you from? It doesn't mean where do you come from. It means literally, where did you just come from? So did you just come from the breakfast downstairs? I would expect you to tell me, yeah, I just came from breakfast. So where are you from? Breakfast? Where are you from? The store? Where are you from? The filling station? So that's a small example. And Americans would be asked that question and they'd say they're from Pittsburgh or from, from New York or Atlanta. And Liberians would scratch their head like, no, no, no. Where did you just come from? That's one small example of not understanding the culture.
Interesting. What were the cultural tensions during that time that you were actually addressing, so our audience can get a grasp of your subject matter expertise and where it was, developed or how it was developed? Like what were you actually solving to at that time?
Well, one of the big challenges I had in Liberia is marrying up Liberian expectations with American expectations. The Bush administration at the time was kind of forced into dealing with Liberia. They didn't want to deal with it. But what happened is that Liberians were frustrated by the war and they started dumping the bodies of people who had been killed in the Civil War outside the American embassy gate,
Wow.
which forced the Bush administration to take action in 2003. They were kind of distracted by Iraq and Afghanistan and the Philippines and Colombia. And so Liberia was the last thing they wanted on their hands. That's why the Africa Command exists, because Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense and he didn't want to deal with Africa. He's like, I'm tired of dealing with these distractions in Africa. We need to have a command focused on Africa so I can focus on Afghanistan and the Philippines and Iraq and all that. So they dumped all these bodies in front of the embassy, ironically, in front of the building I wound up living when I lived there. And so it got the Americans' attention. We deployed troops there, a couple Navy ships off the coast. We put a few hundred Marines and Army into the embassy compound to defend it. And then it kind of turned the tide in that Civil War. And Charles Taylor gave up and fled to Nigeria when we worked out an agreement with him. So Liberian expectations were very different than American expectations about where it was going. The American government signed up to help the Liberians reform and rebuild their military under security sector reform. The UN did that for the policing, and they did a poor job of it, but that's another story. So when I got there, I had a defense minister who was very astute when it comes to domestic Liberian politics, Brownie Samakai. He got it. He knew how to move in and out. He knew how to shoot a schmooze, what to do, how to open doors, how to close doors. And he was very astute as a politician in Liberia. But he didn't get America. He thought he got it. And so when I got there, my predecessor didn't like Brownie Samakai, and they didn't get along. It was like oil and water. So my predecessor didn't share information. And frankly, he could get away with that because the armed forces of Liberia were being rebuilt under the aegis of the United States government. And so we paid for everything, and they basically were our responsibility. It wasn't an army for the Liberians at that stage. So the Ministry of Defense, ironically, didn't own its army, if that makes sense to you. The Americans kind of owned it. It wasn't really an army yet. It was in training. So my predecessor, because of the nature of the contract with the State Department, didn't have to tell the minister anything. And he didn't. He kept him in the dark, which really irritated him. Fair enough. I came there and tried to repair this broken relationship. And I said, listen, I will tell you everything I can. And I did that. But the guy just didn't get it. When Michael Phillips from the Wall Street Journal came over and wrote stories about the security sector reform and about Liberia in general, he interviewed Brownie Samakai, and he kept complaining about the exact same thing. Well, I don't know this. The Americans are keeping this from me, and this, that, and the other. And the irony is that I've been giving him all kinds of information for 3 or 4 months at this point. And so eventually he caught on and realized that he was getting information that, I mean, it was legal for me to give it. There was nothing wrong there. But I was just cooperating with him, and he didn't get that initially. So my point is that I understood the culture that Brownie Samakai didn't understand internationally and for the U.S., and I was trying to help him. And eventually he caught on to that, and the relationship between the two of us was pretty good, and we advanced the program. But he still had his own agenda domestically, and that caused me a lot of hiccups in Liberia. I anticipated these problems, but you just can't prevent some problems. But we managed to take the Armed Forces of Liberia from 102 soldiers in a proof of concept army to the target, which was 2,000. When I left Liberia,
Wow.
2,137 soldiers had been fully trained, and we had vetted them, and we had built barracks for them. We had trained them in specialty skills. About half of the specialty skills have been trained, but everyone had been trained to be an infantryman, so they're all qualified. But then, like intelligence analysts and medics and admin people, that training, about half that was done because we had to balance the money. And then, so that's kind of what was going on. I left there. 13 individual companies had been activated. The first battalion was activated. The force structure had been met. The one thing we were lacking at is that we didn't have the equipment, because there wasn't enough money to buy trucks, so we borrowed trucks from ECOWAS and things like that. But most of the security sector reform program for Liberia was completed by the time I left. I did that for a program that had been envisioned like 5 years prior in about 13 months. It was crazy.
Many of our listeners are entrepreneurs, executives trying to climb this ranks of team building and leadership. And what wisdom could you impart on our listeners to do something that was 5 years in the making in 13 months? What was if you go back there, what did you do? What did you not do, firstly? And then where'd you focus your energy?
Well, interesting enough, it's going to sound ironic because some of the people in Liberia wouldn't have seen it this way because people always have their own perspective of things. But from my perspective, I entered this as a very humble person. I really did. I didn't come in as if I knew everything. I came in as if I was learning. I listened to people. But the problem is that as a leader, you need to do that. You need to listen to people, but you also have to take decisions. And I had to very quickly start taking decisions. And some people wanted things their own way, and their own way was in their own parochial interests. So I think as a leader, one of the key things you need to do culturally is quickly understand the parochial interests, where people are coming from and what they want, because everyone's got a different objective. I had 2 contractors that were working for the government when I arrived there, and they were at each other's throats, and they were undermining the program. That wasn't their intent, but their intent was to outcompete each other. But the problem was that they were undermining the advancement of the program. So what I did is on a Wednesday, after being there I was there for a couple weeks with my predecessors, we overlapped, and then I took over the program. After about a month of seeing this, I said, stop. Both program managers will be at the embassy every Wednesday at 4 o'clock. You will meet with me every Wednesday at 4 o'clock, and we will do a VTC, or it was a VTC, it was a telephone call with the contracting officer back at the State Department, and we're going to sort this out. And then I quickly took charge and I told them how it was going to be because I was responsible for execution of those contracts. And we got it under control. That chafed some people, but both of those program managers actually liked it because they could go back to their staff and say, well, the guy at the embassy won't let us do this. The colonel, I was a major then, but quickly I became a colonel right after that, a few weeks later. The colonel won't let us do that. You can't do that. That's not legal. We can't. We're going to have to do it this way. And so that gave them some top cover, and they appreciated that. But some people chafed at it. My point is that understanding where people are coming from, empathizing with them, it doesn't mean that you have to feel bad for them or good for them. But when I say empathize, get where these people are coming from, and that's not always easy. And I'm not professing to be a subject matter expert on it, but I am saying that I've had a great deal of success by putting myself in the shoes of others, because in many cases I've been there. I mean, when I go to Africa, let me give a side note in here. I was in Uganda. I went to a village in the southwestern part of Uganda on an HIV program. We were paying for the HIV program, so I went out with the Uganda People's Defense Force, the UPDF, and we went out to this remote village, and they asked me to speak. Well, they speak a language there. I didn't even know the language. And look, I know a lot about languages, but I didn't know the language. So one of the soldiers in the UPDF was from that area. So he was my interpreter. So I got to watch people's faces as I said what I said in English, and they understood some of it. And then when he translated it or interpreted it into their own language, watch the shock. And I said to them, I said, look, you see me standing up here. I'm an American. I'm white. I'm from America and a soldier. And you probably have notions about who I am or where I come from. But you might be surprised that we have more in common than you realize. And they're getting very intent. It's a bunch of women coming for free medical care and some elderly people, and they start leaning forward in their seats. I said, for instance, I bet some of you don't have piped water. You probably get your water from a well. And I said, do you? And some of them raised their hands. I said, you have to carry that water for a distance. Yep. Okay. Would you be surprised to learn that I didn't have piped water when I was in high school? I had to fetch water from a cistern. And I'll bet you use an outdoor privy. As we call it, an outhouse in America, where you go to do your business. And then they smiled and laughed. Yeah, yeah. I said, well, that's what I did in high school. And I said, but you have an advantage. And they look at me like, how do we have an advantage if we have the same thing you had? I said, it's not minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit when you're going to the bathroom in January. So when you go to outdoor privy in January in Ohio, you don't spend much time in there. So that broke the ice and broke the barriers down. And they could relate to me, and I could relate to them. And it goes on from there, but I don't want to spend all this time for your listeners. But
Love that.
That's what I'm getting at when you try to relate to people and understand it. Here's the thing, Jay. Everyone has a story. You talk to people, and a lot of people I interview on my program, oftentimes I don't know if people want to listen. I don't really have anything to say. Everybody has a story, but the key is for the storyteller, the interviewer, or the person interacting. If you understand people, you can make even the most boring people sound interesting, because everybody's got a story in their life. We all deal with hardship. We all deal with adversity. Sometimes some of us deal with success, but everyone's got an interesting story. And if you're a good storyteller, you can take that and turn it into something, and you can engage people. And that's kind of the approach I've taken all over the world.
For our listeners that have not experienced the world outside of America, right? The international landscape. There's many things that we may take for granted. What role does intelligence, counterintelligence, the actual roles and responsibilities that individuals like yourself that are out there, what is that really? I want to go deep. Like, what is intelligence, counterintelligence, and how does that impact all of us, whether we realize it or not?
Well, that's two very different things. Let me answer the first one. Hopefully, I won't forget the second thing. Well, the first one is, ironically, a lot of people go into intelligence in the Army. They ask for that field when they assess into the Army as an officer, thinking they're going to be Jason Bourne or Sean Connery, 007, shaken not stirred. Anyway, it's not even remotely like that. Now, I didn't think that, because I'd actually been in the Army and I saw what the Army did from a tactical intelligence standpoint. Your role is to anticipate what the threat is and what the enemy, if there's an enemy, is going to do. When I say the threat, that includes weather, that includes, electrical short, anything that could harm your mission is a threat potentially. So, you have to look at that from that standpoint. And then the enemy. And of course, the enemy we were learning about for the most part was, North Korea as a side thing, but then also the Soviet Union at that time. But an intelligence officer in the Army, for instance, is someone who is taking information gaps, and making analysis and making predictions for leadership. And the purpose of making that is so we reduce the impact of combat. Or if we have a humanitarian mission, we reduce the risk. So we're trying to reduce risk to kill as few people as possible, do as little damage as possible to ourselves and others. So that's what intelligence officers' responsibility is. But it's not Jason Bourne. I mean, there are people like that, but that's so few people. That's not the average intelligence officer. Now, the irony for me, Jay, is that the Army sent me to Fort Huachuca, And I used to read what's A Prayer for Owen Meany by John, what's his name, the author from New England who wrote The World According to Garp. Anyway,
I don't know that one.
yeah, but anyway, he wrote The World According to Garp. He also wrote a book, A Prayer for Owen Meany, and it's a book I read as I was graduating from college, and there was a character in there who had been sent to the intelligence school at Fort Huachuca. And it's a character development, and I wound up going to the intelligence school in Fort Huachuca, so it's kind of ironic, but. The intelligence school I thought would teach me all these skills and analytical analysis and understanding culture and people. Nah. Now, I went to 6 months of training at the Army Intelligence Center, and I spent 3.5 months learning about the U.S. military's how to do offense and defense. And that
Mm,
might strike you as strange. And as a lieutenant, I'm scratching my good, why am I learning this? But I quickly realized that you can't tell your boss what the danger is to his troops or her troops unless you understand how you operate. So we spent more time in my intelligence officer basic course learning U.S. Army doctrine and military doctrine for the U.S. military than people in the infantry course did or people in the armor course did because they learned the tactical level. But as an intelligence officer, we learned the tactical and the operational level. And then later you learn strategic. So we only spent a short period of time learning about Soviet threat. And basically what that was rote memorization. You get a class, this is the structure, these are the artillery pieces. So what I learned very quickly, Jay, because I'm like a sponge, I like to learn
yeah.
things all the time. I learned that in order to be an expert in my craft, I was going to have to teach myself. So I quickly looked at intelligence from a holistic standpoint
To think.
to think, to go beyond what they gave me. The Army gives you a toolbox. And if you engage that toolbox and you use it and you add things to it over time, you can become better at what you're doing. So for me, I've always looked at things not about tomorrow, not about next week, but next year, 3 years, 5 years, 10, 15, 20
I
years.
have a question on
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
process of it. The tactical, operational, strategic. How much of the tactical and operational could just be that institution um conditioning in a sense the majority of persons to perform as opposed to thinking like there's an interesting paradox I think in this
I get where you're going
and
with
you kind
that.
of like could see through the veil and then you're like oh wait let me get to the if you could unpack that a bit I
Yeah, no,
can't make
I like where you're going with that. So that's actually what it is. The Army teaches you the basic what you need to know, so you're successful. So, for instance, I'm kind of cynical, and I used to say when I was an intelligence officer at battalion and brigade, that's staff position. So it's called S2. You have S1, 2, 3, 4, like that. S1 is administration, 2 is intelligence, 3 is operations, 4 is logistics, and it goes on at the higher level staffs. But at a battalion and brigade, you're an S. So I was an S2, and when I was an S2, I was very successful at what I did at battalion and brigade level. In fact, I was a lieutenant doing a major's job, which is several ranks higher,
yeah
because I was so successful. But I tell people is that the Army gives you the tools to do at that level. But as you said, it's I watched The Wizard of Oz. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain, the great and powerful Oz. And so I could see beyond the veil and go, in order to understand this, I got to do it better. And for me, the light actually went on in Army training, Jay. One little brief period of training that we got as a lieutenant at the intelligence course was about what was called low intensity conflict. Now that became military operations other than war or unconventional war or where we're at today. They keep changing them. But we looked at like insurgencies in Latin America and we're planning where people could store weapons and weapon caches based on the terrain, based on the village, looking at human cultural geography. The Army wasn't really teaching that, but the skills I'd already learned at university and then the ones that later on came into play. And that course kind of prompted me into thinking that I have to think about intelligence holistically. I have to look at the economic factors. I have to look at the health factors. So if I get a little bit away from this, but to explain this point, when I went to South Africa on a trip in 2000, as part of my time working at the embassy in Tunisia, traveling around Africa to get familiarization with the continent, I went to Botswana and I went to this place called the Botswana Christian AIDS Intervention Program, BOCAPE. And what it was people trying to help overcome HIV. There was a Danish woman there. Her husband was a pastor. She was working for them as an NGO. And I walked in. I had a business card I pre-made with my GeoCities email address on it. That's how long ago this was, GeoCities. And I gave it to her. It says, Captain Wyatt, Ame de Terre des États-Unis, because French international language, and my email address. And I gave it to her. And we talked, and she was listening, and she quickly realized I know an awful lot about HIV. And then she said, so I got to stop you for a second. I'm confused. You said you're in the U.S. Army. I said, yes. And you're in Botswana. I said, yes, ma'am. And you want to understand HIV? Yes, ma'am. Why? Why would you care about HIV? I said, well, man, now remember, I'm a captain and I've been back in the Army at this point for 10 years or so. just before I made major. And I said, ma'am, HIV is a slate wiper. It's a game changer, particularly in Southern Africa. Now, this is before it exploded in Southern Africa. I said, listen, in America, people who are affected by HIV tend to be people who are affluent in the gay community, but not exclusively, but and they tend to be people with skills. And if we lose a banker or a loan officer or an administrator or a city council member, that's tragic. But here in Botswana, with a population of 2 million, if you lose a banker, it's catastrophic. If a person who gets HIV as a banker and they die, the impact is far greater. And that affects security. That could affect human security. So I said, as an intelligence officer in the Army and as a regional specialist, I look at food security, human security, health security, geopolitical factors, and then also, threats, terrorism and criminal activity. So I look at things holistically. So that's kind of
Yeah.
how I brought all this stuff together. And the Army didn't teach me that. I worked with all the other intelligence agencies. They didn't teach me that. I realized that on my own, and I developed my career path along those ways. And I think that's why I was successful.
If you were to say how, and then we'll come back to the things we take for granted, but if you were to say how the food, health, geopolitical, human threats, criminal, they, like how they intersect or how they interrelate, how would you describe that or begin to? Like, for example, I'm just thinking like if what you just said about if this rampant disease is mucking about, what toll could that take on a family? And then how, oh, did we just create a terrorist or
Well, I'm not sure how to answer your question other than that, yes, you're on the right track, but let me relate it to something we can all relate to,
like, did you
COVID.
have a process even? Okay.
Oh, no, let me relate to COVID. So when COVID started, when this nonsense started, this is not how human communities react to pandemics, the way that we did this. You don't shut down movement. What you do in a pandemic normally is you isolate the vulnerable with physical barriers if possible. That's why we had leper colonies. Okay. Now, I'm not a medical professional, but I'm an intelligence officer and intelligence analyst. So you isolate the vulnerable. That's why you used to have leper colonies. We keep the lepers away from people. They can't spread it, okay? People with TB, you keep them away from people. So you isolate the people who are infected. You isolate the people who are vulnerable so they don't come in contact with each other. The healthy population goes about its business. Many of them will contract this disease and they're healthy enough to overcome it. They knock it out and they
That's
build
interesting.
immunity. And that's how you get the concept of herd immunity. But when this thing started, they lied to people about this and they misled people. So from the very beginning, I was calling this out and saying, wait a second. But I guess beyond that, Jay, I looked at it from a holistic standpoint. When they announced they were shutting down the schools, my first complaint was, hey, I'm paying taxes. Give me my tax money back. You don't have the schools open, facetiously. But seriously, I would like to have it back. But then I said, what are you doing? You're shutting down schools. You're sending 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds home. They are going to be at home and they're not socializing. I said this in February of 2020, Jay. They're not socializing because they're talking about closing. They didn't close them in February. They closed them after that. But I said, these kids are not going to socialize. You are going to develop a generation of psychopaths who do not know how to interact with each other. You see, I'm looking 15 years down the road when these kids become
Sure.
adults because they don't know how to interact. They don't know how to deal with bullies. They don't know how to socialize with others. And I said, you can't simply take kids and not give them education when they're 5, 6, and 7 years old, because when they come back and try to learn reading, they're not 1 year behind, they're several years behind. I said this, now we're seeing the analysis from these fools who undermine our social cohesion and our society, who are now going, oh, we have serious developmental issues with these kids and behavior issues. No kidding. I told you that in 2020 because as an intelligence analyst, even though I don't teach primary school and even though I don't hang around with kids, I get the human condition. It's like those under the age of 5 who don't get sufficient protein develop stunting and they'll never recoup that mental capacity. They'll
Wow.
always be stunted. It's the same thing with this education. We are going to have a problem, mark my words, Jay, with the kids who are in that cohort for 2 or 3 years when they become adults.
This actually goes to the earlier question about the things that we take for granted. So for our listeners, yeah, how 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 does so you work with Department of Defense, the National I don't know, wait, Security Agency,
I worked in
right?
the National
Was one of
Security
them,
Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency,
NIA.
yeah. Defense
Okay.
Intelligence Agency, yeah.
Yeah. So how are our lives what they are as a consequence of, I think I want to start there, like the work that people like you do. What do we take for granted? Like,
Oh, well, one thing I can tell you take for granted is people assume that life is safe. the number of terrorist plots and attempts against Americans and on our soil that have been foiled by the intelligence community, which they can never tell people, would scare you. You might not sleep at night. I mean, people take for granted it's safe to do things. It's not. Also, it's kind of like so. Here's another thing. You know, I used to build computers. And I used computers since the 70s, back when I had to put IBM data punch cards in to load instructions, and then cassette tapes to load the operating instructions into Commodore PCs and floppies and so on. And I built my own PCs, and I've one of the first people to put websites up back in 1995 on the internet when it came up. And so I've been with computers a long time, and I was in the realm of dealing with cybersecurity from the outset. And another thing people take for granted is they think that, if I'm not online, I'm safe. No, you're not. Yeah, your information is online whether you like it or not. You don't have to have a single telephone. You don't have to have a single social media account. You don't have to do anything online. You're in jeopardy because this information is all online and it can be broken into. So the best you can do is take measures, countermeasures to protect yourself. I'm not advocating LifeLock or something like that, but you need to be aware of it. You actually need to be on the internet so you're paying attention to threats about you. We're all at threat. Identity theft, we're all at threat of people threatening us and intimidating us online or stealing from us. It's just a reality because so much is digitized now. And I saw this 30 years ago coming, it's just a matter of time. And then the other threat is that people, and this is where people are acting the fool, and it's really playing out strangely in America now with these idiots keying Teslas and burning Teslas. You do realize there's like 6 cameras in a Tesla. They're recording everything you do in real time, right? You morons. I mean, it's like that for life. I mean, everywhere you go, there's surveillance, whether you realize or not. It's a surveillance society. So people take for granted that they can act the fool. You can act the fool and you can abuse others because it's so much easier to find transgressors today. I mean, we will have serial killers in the future, but the days of Ted Bundy and the Green River Killer and stuff like that, and all the stuff, the BTK and all that going undetected forever, those days hopefully are over because of where technology is and our surveillance society that we have. But people take for granted that they're safe, and I'm not trying to frighten people, but you have to be awake. Not woke, but awake. You have to be awake to be aware of what's going on around you. Cybersecurity is a serious concern and affects all of us. Me personally, I keep waiting for the phone to ring and Mr. Fuji to call me or Mr. Wang to call me from the Chinese intelligence agency going, so, Colonel Wyatt, we understand that you once upon a time were accused of sleeping with goats. Where did you hear that from? Well, we have access to your security clearance dossier. And they do, because the Office
Wow.
of Personnel Management, OPM, did not protect our security clearances for 21 million Americans who had top secret and secret clearances. And those files are full of false accusations about people. As a counterintelligence agent, I can tell you that people are often accused of things they've never done by spiteful people, by ex-spouses, by people who are jealous of them, civilians and military. And I've investigated many of these cases where people accused of heinous things, they never did it. But that is in a file so that when their security clearance gets renewed, they look at it and, it's part of the adjudication process to continue your clearance. So 21 million people have had their clearance information compromised multiple times. In fact, OPM is so irresponsible that for 18 months, the first breach, they didn't even know that people were in their databases stealing this information. It took them a year and a half before they even realized it. And then what they did, they sent letters out to those 21 million people, and they said, we'll offer you a year of identity theft protection. They owe us a lifetime of identity theft protection because one day Mr. Wang is going to call from the Chinese Central Bureau and say, Colonel Wyatt, we want the secret codes to whatever. You know what I'm saying?
Wow.
So anyway, but my point is
Unbelievable.
that people take things for granted. And you need to be very careful about your own security. One of the better developments, not foolproof, that's happened the past few years is this multi-factor authentication, where you're using an authenticator app or you have to, like, they send you a text message. I mean, that's not foolproof, but it's much better. But as people use passwords like 1234, please stop doing that. That's not very smart.
How do you burden the responsibility while being in the system on that level? Like, how do people actually deal with the stress, like having clearances and having so much information to hold on to?
Well, I'm not sure how, for me, I guess it's second nature. I mean, obviously there are things that I know that I could never disclose, and millions of people are in this boat that they in business, you have corporate trade secrets you can never disclose. Look, it's interesting because to answer that question, let me go back to Julian Assange and to Edward Snowden and their, I think, idiotic behavior that they think that they have a right to disclose government secrets. When they say that, I say, you do realize that secrets are necessary for negotiation. Like right now, Trump and these tariffs, you have to have secrets. If you don't have secrets, you walk into the bargaining table, then your opponent knows your strengths and weaknesses. You're not going to get what you want. But if you're good at negotiating, even from weakened position, you can look. Finland stayed neutral. It was never absorbed by the Soviet Union because they fought back in the Winter War and stopped the Soviets. And they said it's not worth the juice, is not worth the squeeze. So they let Finland be. But the cost was Finland had to be neutral, and the whole verb Finlandization came about as a consequence of that. So what happens here is that you have to. You have to make. I've lost my train of thought there, Jay, with that anecdotal story.
Just
Sorry.
burdening this. No, it's
Oh
great.
yeah,
But
with
like
the clear.
because I meet
Okay,
people every day in business and can't keep
their
just the
mouth shuts.
conversation. Yeah, you, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So that's practical advice, I think, for even small business that are listening to this that haven't quite made it and they not cognizant that that's a part of why they haven't.
So last night, my conversation online when I did a live broadcast, someone said something very apropos to this conversation. They said intelligence and wisdom are two different things. Intelligence is knowing what to say. Wisdom is knowing when to say it. And that was spot on. So, for instance, there are times you can share information. This morning, I had a guest that couldn't show up, and I couldn't disclose to my audience why, because it's not possible. So what I did is I diverted to another topic and said they're not available. We'll look at trying to reschedule it. That's the wisdom. I mean, I could have been spiteful and said why the person didn't come on the program, but there's nothing gained by that. No one's helped by that. So that's part of it. Where I was going, I remember my point now. The senior moment has passed. I'm back to my point. So the point was that people are entitled secrets. So I always ask people, if you're married, do you want your spouse to know every time you turn and look at some attractive woman or every thought that goes through your mind? No, that's your business. That's inside your head. Don't think outside your head. And by the same token, every time your wife, crushes on Vince Gill or whoever, that's her business. Okay. We don't act on those things. What we think in our mind, people are entitled to secrets. Businesses are entitled to secrets. It's necessary to outcompete your competitors. And governments are entitled to secrets. Let me give you another anecdotal story and show you why that's a problem. So I worked at the African Union. The African Union headquarters building in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia was built by the Chinese government. Thank you. That's lovely. $163 million building. Well done, China. Except I warned people when I was working there. I said, look, if you want to have a conversation, let's go to a coffee shop. They're like, why? I said, because you can't talk here. What do you mean can't talk here?
Wow.
We walk outside. You do realize there's cameras and listening devices everywhere in this building. What are you talking about? The Chinese built it. Do you see that construction building out there at the front gate? The building was finished 3 years ago. Why is there a construction company here now? They're not building anything. Those are Chinese spies with the listening equipment. No, they're not. 3 years after I left Addis Ababa, the story broke that the Chinese had put listening devices and cameras in all the conference rooms and all the meeting spaces of the African Union. And everything that the Africans had discussed in private when they went to the negotiating table to try to get things from China, the Chinese knew exactly what their bargaining position was. So you're entitled to your secrets. You're not entitled to cover-ups, lies, and deception and malicious behavior. That's a different story. So if the government does something wrong, if they're spying on people illegally, then they should be exposed. But the government, so for instance, let's go to Jeffrey Goldberg, this nonsense with the Atlantic. This is my take on Jeffrey Goldberg. He should be charged under the Espionage Act. And he's going to go, no. Freedom of the press, First Amendment. No, it's not freedom of the press. You don't have a right to disclose classified information. And if it's not classified information, the information you gave about the strike package, if that's real, because you felt the need to show that you actually had access to it, that was irresponsible. You've disclosed methods that the U.S. government does to do things. That's defense information. You can be prosecuted under U.S. law under the Espionage Act for passing defense information. It doesn't have to be classified. It doesn't have to be Joe Biden leaving top secret documents in his little think tank or in his Corvette. All it has to be is defense information. You can be prosecuted for that. And that is a case of Goldberg acting irresponsibly, not as a journalist, because the moment, if I'm an independent journalist, if I somehow wound up in a Signal chat session with Pete Hegseth, maybe I'll stay and listen, but I'm not going to say anything about it. But one thing I'm definitely going to issue for sure, I suspect, is leave it, and I'm going to call the FBI. And I'm going to call the Office of Director of National Intelligence and say, listen, I just inadvertently wound up in a conversation with the Secretary of Defense, the Director of National Intelligence, and the Secretary of State. I shouldn't have been in there. Something odd happened. You need to know about this so they can do an investigation. And then I would never have disclosed to the public that I was in that meeting. You've harmed the U.S. national interest. And then by sharing that information, he's violated the law. And I think he should be prosecuted under the Espionage Act. The point here is that knowledge is one thing, wisdom is the second thing.
What are the powers that be perceive of all of these platforms we're using within what you may or may not be able to share? But just, I guess, if you can
You mean
give an
social
opinion
media?
on
You mean social
these
media platforms?
social platforms, and do they pose an existential threat to institutions that govern our
Well,
societies at this given moment? Are they being taken seriously? Should they, in your view? Like, yeah, I'd love to get your brain on that.
Well, for those who are astute, who are leaders, politicians, and leaders in the bureaucracy and the military, who get it, then they innately understand that social media is a threat. It's a threat because it collapses time and space. I mean, look at how people can get demonstrations instantaneously by using things. How they can raise money for good causes and bad causes through Backup Buddy and GoFundMe and things overnight. Look how GoFundMe screwed Canadian truckers who did not violate the law under pressure from Canada's fascist leaders by using counterterrorism laws to shut down legal protests and destroy the lives of people in the trucking industry because they were a nuisance. So those who are astute realize that social media can be a weapon, intentionally or otherwise, unintentionally, against your national interests. And it can change an argument and it can change national opinion. And I would relate this to Tet in 1968. No war was televised every night until Vietnam. That was the first nightly television war. Tonight in Vietnam, 37 communists were killed, that sort of nonsense every day. But we were told, well, I was an infant, but we were told in 1968 that the war in Vietnam was going well, that we were winning the war because they were using body counts. Well, the number of people you kill is not an indication of how successful you are, but we allowed ourselves to be deluded into that as a society. And then suddenly, for the celebration of Tet, the Viet Cong attacked the American embassy. There were comments on shooting at Americans in the American embassy. Saigon, there were attacks everywhere. Now, the reality from a military standpoint is that Tet was a disaster for the Viet Cong. They were destroyed as an operational force, as a guerrilla force. They were never effective after that. The North Vietnamese army also lost thousands of people as a consequence of the Tet offensive. But the strategic point for America, the center of gravity for America was public opinion. And the center of gravity shifted when we saw on nightly television Americans under attack all over Vietnam simultaneously. How can you be winning a war when the enemy is on your embassy compound and are in your neighborhood shooting at you? So Tet was the center of gravity, which shifted the opinion of war. And from then on, we were never going to win Vietnam no matter what we did. We win military, we still lose strategically. And that's the thing. That's the thing about social media. Astute leaders in government, in the military, see this. They understand that. That's why I'm so angry, and I haven't said this, but I'm angry about this Signal situation. Not because they disclosed anything, but because they were on Signal. It's stupid. They
What
have
Signal? Wait, what is Signal? I'm
Oh,
not
it's
following.
like WhatsApp
Okay,
Telegram. Signal is another one of these apps. And so Signal app, this is a whole situation going on where Pete Hegseth and the others were on there supposedly sharing information, and Jeffrey Goldberg from the Atlantic was in the conversation.
okay.
Okay, so I'm upset that they're using Signal for this when they have secure video teleconferencing capabilities everywhere they're at. They don't need to be on this app on their phones. That's lazy, and they're compromising, not recognizing the threat. And now look at this. This is a political issue. It's an own goal for the Trump administration, which has been moving smoothly. Some people might argue with that, but they've been moving with a purpose. Executive order, action, action, action. They have clearly a plan on what they attempt to do because they know 2 years, if they don't retain the House of Representatives, then it's all impeachment stuff over and over and they won't get anything done. So they're moving out with a purpose. But now this is a distraction. Leaders should have seen this and anticipated this and known the impact of social media. Signal's a social media app, and it's undermining the administration right now. So my point there is that social media is something that leaders anticipate. Analysts say the same thing. But I will tell you, Jay, my experience is a lot of these people don't get it. And business the same way. So here's a lesson I keep bringing lessons back.
Yeah.
So Netscape. Huge fan of Netscape. Brilliant company started by Jim Clark and Mark Anderson, the guy that wrote the first graphical browser at University of Illinois at Carbondale back in the 1990s, early 90s. And we all went from using text, which was frustrating on the internet. Most people didn't know the internet existed at that time. It started with DARPANET and then became the internet. And then we went to graphical browsers in 94 and they started. But Netscape came out with a fantastic browser. And then they had a great email program. But they were competing with Microsoft, which was lazy and made a terrible browser, Internet Explorer, which didn't work. It didn't load graphics. It crashed all the time. And so Microsoft tried to destroy them by bundling all of their browsers in their software and not loading up Netscape. And people didn't know about it. So by default, they used Microsoft's crappy product. Netscape sued them. And what people forget is Netscape won something like $650 million lawsuit for monopolistic practices or anti-competitive practices by Microsoft. In that trial, Bill Gates, the genius, multi-billionaire, the philanthropist, Bill Gates discovered a hard lesson. Email is subject to discovery. So He was saying things in email in which he was openly telling, because he thought it was private, that he was telling other people how to undermine Netscape and destroy Netscape, which is how they got convicted and they had to pay the fine to Netscape. So my point is that people forget that social media is forever. My father was what do they call those folks? They deal with flags. He was big into flags. Comes from Latin. I can't think of it right now. But in the 1980s, on a message board, he wrote a message about a certain flag. I forget what it was. Around 2002, 2003, I was looking for something online, and I did a search, and either one of the search engines, AltaVista or Google, one of them turned up this search, and I clicked on it, and it was from a message board that my father had posted like in 1984, 85 on the internet, before people even knew there was an internet. So this stuff lasts forever. It sits on a server somewhere. So politicians and leaders need to understand that, and need to understand that these issues can come back and it can haunt you. So you got to be very careful about what you do, and you have to understand the impact of social media. And I don't think that today people fully appreciate that. Most people don't, because you sit behind a keyboard and you're a keyboard warrior. You have anonymity, except you don't. Earlier today, my life was threatened by someone online. They threatened me, and what they don't realize is that I know exactly where they are because I'm able to trace their email. And so, if they get a knock from Interpol or the local police, don't be surprised.
You mentioned it's powerful that time and space is compressing. In a sense, is that there's less friction on the feedback loop, so values and truth is impacted by that. Meaning, it's like, it's this quote: a lie can get around the world before the truth even gets out of bed or something. I'm thinking of that quote, and I'm thinking, if you're saying time and space is compressed.
Well, it is. And I think you're on the right track where I'm going with this. So the thing is that your decision cycle, your decision loop is compressed. If you're a leader in business, if you're a leader in government, your ability to react to something or to anticipate it is greatly reduced by events beyond your control and a time frame that you cannot control. So, for instance, when President Trump issued an executive order about South Africa, South African politicians running around complaining that America is attacking South Africa. And in the past, the president of South Africa could have had a speech before his country, which wouldn't have been on the internet. It wouldn't have been in the newspapers because it's in South Africa. But President Ramaphosa went on to his speech, his State of the Nation address, like our State of the Union address. And instead of talking about South Africa's prospects, in the first minute he says, "We will not be bullied." In other words, directing that to President Trump. I don't think that went over very well in the White House or with his staff, because it was a direct message at President Trump. And President Trump had not bullied South Africa. He'd simply suspended aid around the world. And we had opened up a program potentially for refugees from South Africa. But because of that, that quickly escalated. And now South Africa is in a very difficult position. Their ambassador acted foolish in a Zoom session. He called Donald Trump the leader of a global white supremacist movement. This is the ambassador to the United States. And then he said that Americans are racist. Well, no doubt there are racists in America. There are stupid people the world over, Jay. But fortunately, there's a small number of people, black, white, and brown, who are racist. There's not many of them, thankfully. But that stupid comment, which I suspect was intentional, was relayed around the world within hours because someone recorded the Zoom session and loaded it up on YouTube. And within a matter of hours, it was carried by Breitbart. And within 4 hours after Breitbart, the South African ambassador to the United States. Now, bear in mind that throughout the apartheid period, when we had difficult relations with apartheid South Africa, we never expelled an ambassador. It's not unheard of, but it's rare. Within 4 hours, Marco Rubio declared Ibrahim Rasool persona non grata because of what he did on social media. And he was deported out of the country and can never come back. Wow. I mean, that has ruptured an already fragile relationship between South Africa and the United States. And right now, South Africa diplomats can't get an office call with anybody in DC. I mean, I bet you if they called Uber, they probably can get a ride right now.
So, okay, from an intelligence standpoint, these platforms and how they're influencing those at the highest of the highest order, the highest rank. What can that, from taking it in your lens, a holistic, multidisciplinary approach, what could that mean for stabilization or the lack thereof in the future? In some sense, I'm asking if that type of behavior, let's say, that type of cultural milieu is occurring of the highest order. That seems like more of a quote unquote third world um, a third world way, and this is just my bias, but a third from ignorance, a third world way of navigating interpersonal conflict, or amongst those at that higher ranks, if that's a consequence of the psychological influences of these social platforms on our neurophysiology, that scares me from like a not even geopolitical, societal destabilization. So I'm curious on your thoughts on that, or where my analysis could be overly overindulgent, or something.
Well, I'm not sure if I'm tracking the third world aspect where you're going because it's across the world. It's everybody. It's the first world too.
Let me clarify the
Okay.
third world. I meant like I'm my in a third world country. This is my bias of being ignorant, lay person. In a third world country, there's an issue of some chiefs, and all of a sudden there's a genocide. But there's so much institutional layers and protections in a first world country. It's unlikely to just escalate to the whole village getting burned to the ground, right? So like that's what I meant by the third world metaphor. It's more of a metaphor.
Gotcha.
How
Okay.
these leaders can just immediately make this, like, right, all of us make decisions very quickly, maybe even based on their most base instinctual inclinations,
Okay.
and the social platforms
So
technologies playing into this.
now I'm going to scare you. Are you ready?
Yeah. i'm
Okay.
I'm still sweating, but I think
Okay.
it's the sweater. I'm
Yeah.
calmer now. Yeah.
Now it won't be the sweater make you sweat. Now you're going to feel it. All right. So here's the scary thing. Corporations have already perfected models like this. Google is so fabulously wealthy because they know how to predict behavior based on past behavior. So we can model how people are going to behave, and we can already do this. Now, as far as the first world and developing world, because that's an old term, third world. People say the developing world,
Oh.
but no, I'm just teasing with you. But that's what the academics like to do. So, as far as the developing world, this is also first world phenomenon. Okay, the Berlin Wall came down literally overnight, because people took a risk and pushed through the border from Hungary into Austria. And just a matter of days, the whole thing, it just came collapsing down. That was the first world, so to speak. This can have
Mm.
an impact in the first world. It's not just look, we were very close in the summer of 2020, which I've sarcastically called the summer of love since it happened. We had an insurrection in this country. People want to talk about January 6th. That's a joke. That wasn't an insurrection. That was a intentional failure of security at the Capitol building. I covered that as a journalist. I was on the ground. And I
Wow.
left. I left before anybody went in the building because it was cold and boring. but anyway, but there were no cops there. I mean, the police there were wearing bicycle helmets and carrying nightsticks, no firearms. There were no barriers. They put up bicycle racks to stop the crowd. They left the television tower unlocked and unguarded so people could climb up on top of it and throw water bottles down on the police. It's complete total cock up. But anyway, the another senior moment just cropped in there. Where was I going with this? That's the second time now. Too many things in my head sometimes. But so I lost track where I was going explaining this. Sorry.
No, it's okay. And that's one of the consequences of a real conversation, I think. Well, you said the developing world, the summer of
Oh
2020,
yeah, yeah, that's
not
where I was
the
going with it. Yeah,
actual
so
insurrection.
right. So in the summer of 2020, in my view, this country was on the edge. We were very close. We had essentially an insurrection in our major metropolitan areas. For instance, when they talk about January 6th, that's why I mentioned January 6th. That wasn't an actual insurrection. No one was attempting to overthrow the government of the United States. People were just acting foolish, and some people got carried away. What actually happened in Seattle, in the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, is a group of people blocked off the federal courthouse, illegally occupied a federal building, and then kept law enforcement out and declared their own autonomous zone. That is an insurrection. That is the definition of insurrection. These people renounced the authority of the United States government and took over our territory and declared it independent, in essence. You'll notice they went from calling it Chaz, they changed the name after a few days because they realized that they were on shaky ground. But that was an example of an insurrection. That happened in Portland, Seattle, D.C., Atlanta, Milwaukee, Baltimore, New York, all of the country. We were on the verge of an insurrection all over this country. And how we survived, and I'm not really sure, because the federal government's reaction was tepid. The Trump administration did virtually nothing to stop this. They should have gone into Chaz and put a stop to it immediately with a show of force. They didn't do it. And so that behavior can manifest overnight. And that's the danger with social media, the ability to organize and share information so rapidly. I mean, if you go back in time, it took days or weeks for people to get information. We only had three broadcast networks. You had to wait once a week for your magazines to come out. You get a newspaper every day, but it only had part of the story. And now everybody's on Twitter.
Mm.
Well, most people are on Twitter, and you can get news instantaneously. You get video, you can see, you can make a judgment for yourself, even if you're wrong. And even if it's just a snippet that's taken out of context, all you see is the person reacting to the provocation that caused them to swing or shoot in the first place. So all of that affects the narrative. And the narrative is what drives public opinion, is what drives anger and emotion. And that's why leaders are so challenged in business and in government today, because they can't get in front of the narrative, especially if they don't anticipate the narrative. So, for instance, I could have told you that Tesla and SpaceX are going to be targeted because the left is not happy with Elon Musk.
Do you think it could be part of Elon's growth business and growth strategy to be so heavily fixated on his personal brand the last 10, I don't know, was it 15 years? Could as a counterbalance or counterweight to that? Because if I'm following your thesis here so far, that the powers that be are taking these platforms very seriously. Not everyone fully gets it though, so that's nothing new, right? The higher you soar, right? Uh, Everything is available, as opposed to uh, not being on it because it'd be available anyway. Be on it and be aware, right? Be proactive. So is um, and as time and space compresses, so things happen before we even can get ahead of it. So what's the best strategy? What would be some strategies? Could Elon, for example, be somebody that is going all in on it and going ahead of it? So try to get a base of so he can react to things that are out of his control.
Well, it,
So I'm curious what your thoughts on that.
Well, in Elon's case, whether it was his intention or not, his personal brand got built because of what he was in, and people glommed on Elon. And I think, the press and social media can have a big impact on building someone's brand. And I think that played a major role. Not that he's a shrinking vial. He's definitely an alpha personality and has pushed his brand. But Elon is one of these visionaries. That's and I'm not a fan or an opponent of Elon. At times, I've said that he's like most entrepreneurs. He's a bit of wackadoodle. I mean, I remember when he went on a radio broadcast and he's talking positively about the use of marijuana. I'm sorry, that's not a good idea on the radio. Kids listen to that stuff. You don't want to talk to them. It's a good idea to be smoking weed, whether you're for weed or not. And so I've always, not fully trusted Elon from that standpoint, his judgment for things like that. He's got 9 kids. That's his prerogative, but I don't think we should all have 9 kids. You got to be able to support him. You're worth, $300 billion. You can support 9 kids, but if you're worth $30,000, you can't support 9 kids. Be reasonable. Anyway, but like most entrepreneurs, he's got quirks about him. And what he does have is vision. SpaceX is a vision he dreamt up 30 years ago as a kid, and it's come to fruition, and I appreciate that. But as far as the whole thing, the reason I mentioned the time and space and what's going on here is that in many ways, social media challenges the very sovereignty of states. And there are some people who come up with the thesis that states will not exist in the future or they'll be undermined by social media. Well, it certainly challenges them, but those with good leadership who anticipate and learn how to harness these tools to their advantage rather than it being a constant problem are the ones who are going to succeed. I don't think that any country has done a particularly successful job at understanding that sphere right now. Some are in the process of learning it. Others are pretty inept at it. The Russians are inept at it. The Chinese are getting good at it, but they've been very inept at it until recently. Now they're starting to get, and the U.S. in the corporate world, we've got people very adept at it, but in government, we got a bunch of dunderheads at times, it seems.
Mm.
So it's just something that people have got to get their head around. But the collapsing of time and space and the decision making cycle really is compressed, and you lose time. And that's why you need people with maturity, because you cannot act emotionally, you cannot act instantaneously. Something you get knee jerk reactions from people. The smartest thing is to say that you get caught off guard. Is that I think Trump the other day, something happened to him. He was caught off guard. He said, I hadn't heard that. I'll have to look into that. I'll get back with you. And sometimes they don't want, that's not enough, but usually that's enough to give you a chance. And then you get your people around you. What the heck is going on here? What just happened here? How do we not know about this? Give me the information, and then listen to your people. And then you digest the information, you go forward from there. But as I said, I think that leaders anticipate these things as best they can, and that's the key. But it's missing in so much. People, look, Jay, this is culture. This is culture. And culture has changed demonstrably with the advent of social media. People who were shrinking violets, who would never say something in the past, feel empowered to say things. Like the guy who threatened my life earlier. Well, what is that? I mean, that guy would never do that to my face. Probably because he'd be very sorry. But my point is that
Yeah.
people feel empowered to do things they wouldn't do otherwise and act the fool. Look at all these people losing their mind, these raging and screaming about Elon Musk and Doge. Whether you like Elon Musk or Doge or not, what is its purpose? To identify fraud, waste, abuse, and misuse of our tax resources. This country is on the verge of insolvency. $38 trillion of federal debt. We've got trillions of dollars of state, county, municipal debt. We have got $150 trillion probably of pension liabilities that are unfunded. On top of that, we've got mortgage debt, we've got consumer debt. This country is so deep in the hole that we'll never get out of it unless we address it. I would think we're almost past the point of solving this, short of, devaluing our currency, which would cause a global financial crisis and the entire system would collapse. So we can't do it. And now someone comes along who wants to cut this stuff out. We spent $1 billion. They weren't making this up to do a survey. I can go on Twitter and do a survey right now. I don't need to spend $1 billion to get people's views on it. $1 billion. And people look the other way. Bridges to nowhere. Money for this, money for that. It's insane. And all the while, what the opponents are doing is attacking Elon Musk because he's not a government official. He's unelected. Well, these bureaucrats who come up with these regulations in the EPA are not lawmakers, and they have the authority to do it because Congress they absolve themselves of responsibility for these EPA regulations, which are put imposed on people that cost them money and actually put people in prison at times. So lots of unelected people are affecting our lives.
I want to this is speculation. I'm nervous to share my thoughts. So it's like the financial advisor shtick. Past performance does not dictate future performance is not financial advice, except culture advice, I guess. But so if you could elaborate on what I'm going to help me out here. So, um, is it okay? We have our culture, our country. Let's say it's okay. In this case, it's the United States of America has a story, has constitution, levers of power to protect its interests internally, so it doesn't implode. There's education system. There's history. There's a monotheistic primary religion. There's rule of law. There's all these things that have to function and move in a beautiful symphony. At the same time, outside of this country, there are all of these other all the same at varying degrees of complexity and alignment and strength and dominance, vying for dominance in the world. So part like isn't what part of what protects our country, not only the work people like you do externally, but these implicit variables functioning, like the story, like the belief in the story, the institutions educating our children, the economic productivity, the acceptance and acting out of the primary religions, and if those start to fragment or disjoint, how can we remain stable in the face of instability, the external world? Um, it's like maybe too big of a question, but it's I'm curious your thoughts.
All
As
right.
as
Well,
an intelligence
sure. Let me try to
agent.
address it as best I can there. Intelligence analyst. I'm not
Yeah,
Jason Bourne.
sorry, analyst and someone with a lot of experience working in actual cultures, right? Like destabilized or like when I look at the research, Botswana, Uganda, and Niger, and all these places where it was like cooperate. There was a security element, but there was also you were training people into something, giving them a purpose, giving them tools to like develop in like an identity ultimately to to
Sure.
protect you were a part of culture transformation ultimately, right? There
Oh,
we have a
absolutely.
giant transformation that is taking place now in our culture, and I think it needs to be discussed, however vaguely.
Well, I can give you a micro example and try to come back to the question about cultural change. When I was in Botswana, the chief of intelligence approached me, Brigadier General Mahosi. Peter Mahosi was a graduate of the Army War College. He approached me and said, "Hey, I'd like you to talk to my staff." I said, "Sure, sir, I'll talk to your staff." Now, the Botswana Intelligence Force wasn't really a force. They didn't have a corps or anything like that. They just had some people assigned intelligence. Probably about, I think, 70 or 80 people total out of a force of 12 to 15,000 in the military. And so I met with them and they're like, okay, Colonel Wyatt, we want this, we want this, we want this. And what they wanted were intelligence training courses in America because they couldn't do the courses themselves. And so I listened for a little bit and I said, guys, I said, listen, your chief of defense force is not going to spend the entire grant money that we give to the Botswana Defense Force to send your people to intelligence courses. You're basically asking for all the money this year. He wants to send people to the War College. He wants to send people to NCO, the Sergeant Major's Academy. He wants to send people to the engineering course in America because we give you grant money. He's not going to give you all this money for intelligence. And I said, besides, and this is a trick I learned a long time ago, you get people to do what you want them to do by making it in their interest and making them think it's their idea. That's two valuable lessons in culture. So I said, what you're really asking for here, and I think that you're just kind of beating around the bush. They weren't. They didn't know what they wanted. I said, what you're asking for here is what you really want is you want someone to help you develop a professional intelligence corps and have the capability to train your own intelligence professionals. Yeah, yeah, that's what we want. We want that. Okay, with that information, I went to the U.S. Africa Command and to other intelligence actors in the government because other people have an interest in how we train intelligence. And if we keep it at the military level and not go beyond that. See, the problem Botswana had was that their intelligence in the Army worked for the Office of the President. There was no Secretary of Defense, no Ministry of Defense. They reported directly to the President because there was no army when Botswana became a country, only the police force. And it wasn't until the Rhodesians kept going across the border to chase guerrillas in the 1960s and 70s or 70s that they realized we need a military. There were several civilians killed in a firefight, and they said, we need a military. So they took some police officers, and then they created a military, and it went from there. So they worked directly for the President. And they were spying on Zimbabweans and political opponents and doing domestic intelligence. And I'm like, guys, your Defense Act doesn't authorize you to do this. You can't do this. You've got to change your culture or you're going to go to jail. If you commit a crime, you're not protected. But they were doing it just because, hey, that's what they do. So they listened to me and the general listened to me. And unfortunately, before they enacted the reforms that I introduced to them, we actually had a case of this. There was this guy named John Kalafatis, who was a wanted criminal. He was a known gangster in Botswana, and the police were looking for him. Well, they went on a joint patrol. The police don't carry firearms in Botswana. It's like the old British bobbies.
Wow.
So the police went on a joint patrol with the intelligence from the Army. Well, the intelligence guys carried sidearms and civilian clothes, even though they're military. They shot like 30 or 40 rounds into this guy's car when he was a threat, and they killed him. Well, the military were charged with murder, and they were prosecuted. And they were pardoned later on, but they went to prison because they had no protection. That was the culture. I said, before this happened, I'm like, you got to change your culture before you get in trouble. So what I suggested is we come up with a program to help them learn. So the program I envisioned was we did a survey of what their intelligence needs were. So we had people come down from the Intelligence Center in Europe and from the Africa Command and myself. And we traveled all over the country. We looked at their operational missions for anti-poaching operations in the Okavango Delta and in the northeast of the country. We looked at their peacekeeping desires. We looked at their training and all the things that are necessary to bring intelligence to the commander so that he's informed and reduces risk to his force and the civilians. And then we gave him a recommendation. We wrote up a white paper. And in that white paper, what I said was, now, I understood the cultural context of Botswana. The Americans from Europe didn't get that. So they would write up recommendations. And I'm like, guys, before this went forward, that's why I was an author. We can't do this. That's not going to work. Botswana can't do that. They don't understand that. That's your American context. You're coming from the UK. You're coming from Germany. It's not going to work. Trust me. And we were able to modify it because we wanted them to have buy-in. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gone with the program we wrote for them. So one of the things I insisted on was that I hate this concept of the U.S. government giving money to people into perpetuity. PEPFAR is an example of that. The President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, a 5-year, $15 billion program that has spent $120 billion over 22 years. We were supposed to help people in a crisis. It's why it's called the emergency plan, so that they can build capacity, and then after 5 years, they take responsibility for it. Well, we're still paying for it around the world to the tune of $30 or $40 billion a year in some cases. Anyway, back to Botswana. So what I suggested was that we need not to feed a man, but we need to teach a man to fish. So this is what we should do. And this is the concept I came up with. And General Ward was the commander of AFRICOM at the time, U.S. Africa Command, and he bought into it, as did the Botswana, because they wanted. And I said, the first year, we send all the trainers, American intel trainers. They come down here and we run an intelligence analyst training course for you to get you started with your first course so you can do it here. Ultimately, you don't want to send your people to America. You want to train them here and occasionally send somebody to America. So we'll bring them down. All the trainers will be Americans. What you do is from that first class of students who graduate, you pick a few who are the best at communicating and are the smartest, because, you know, being an academic doesn't mean you can teach, who would be the best teachers. And then in the next course, we mix them in and we form a team. They come a little bit earlier and they work together, and the Botswana and the Americans do the training together. And by the third course, our people are just advisors who sit back and watch you train and offer advice. That is exactly how it unfolded after I left Botswana. Because I started this program and I went back there a couple years later when I was assigned to Africa Command on a trip, and I went to an event, and that's exactly what was going on. Instead of mostly Americans, it was almost entirely Botswana, and they took over the program. We changed the culture, and they now have responsibility for training their intelligence personnel. I'm still tickled pink to this day.
Wow. So in the sense, okay, that was a question that popped up there, was that when others were attempting to influence that culture, not first taking the time to understand it and speak in the nuances of its language, of its stories, of etc. That doesn't work. You took the time to understand it and to speak and to relate to them at their level, correct? That's part of that worked.
Exactly. But what would happen? Look, there's no fault to be blamed on the Americans. They are intelligence professionals. They were given a mission. They did it. But they don't know the context. They don't know the culture. They don't understand. I understood the culture of the Botswana Defense Force, which is different than the culture of Botswana society.
The
Yeah.
reason I bring that up is because when we think of some of these meta ideas that are floating around in the ether right now of the world, like when you say woke, there are people that identify with that for components of that. You know, based on their interpersonal life, they might have someone in their life that is struggling with some type of, you know, identity conflict, and like, so now they are identifying with a component of whatever that is. But then there's this whole other picture to what that ideology is. And so, but also there's many ideologies floating up in the ether above our head, like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, the um so from an analyst standpoint, these ideas, so the same reason that someone outside trying to come inside and influence, it'll invert or it'll backfire. Something outside that comes inside, could that not be seen as a parasite to a host phenomenon, like an idea? It attacks the central nervous system of the culture, and can destabilize it if it's not understood fully. So, like, for example, when you said woke earlier, I believe there's a percentage of the listeners that maybe haven't read the philosophers or the philosophers, but on an interpersonal level identify with a component of that ideology, like I just said. But they haven't studied the philosophers, and really where that idea or those ideas stem from, what they represent, and how antithetical they are to this governing system, this body of culture, the United States culture. So my question more succinctly would be, uh, when it comes to ideology and it comes to the battle of ideas in this modern society, are these is it is it possible to weaponize these things in the world? And even, if you're going to speak more from opinion or theory, right? Because it's tough to talk anecdotally, but or maybe you can't.
I've got lots of
Like,
anecdotal examples.
yeah, like, because I just, part of my nature, and maybe a bit neurotic, but is to think more, what's possible, like anything. But like if a certain degree of a population buys into ideas, I look at it because I work in small business. So if a certain amount of the employees stop believing in the management, don't relate to the historical narrative, like why the company exists, what its purpose is, how it benefits customers, and how their individual lives can be manifest through working for and with that organization, a coup d'etat is naturally going to take place, even if it's just a mass exodus. So like when that happens to a society, what role do ideas play in the destabilization of a society? And so that when you mentioned the woke idea, I think is runs antithetical to our to the American culture.
Mm. Well, there's a couple different things here. Number one, I believe you're correct that when you come from the outside into an environment, there is a risk that you could become a virus inside the system. And then you have to understand there are stakeholders that are existing that will resist that. So you have to find a way to become culturally aware or understand what's going in that organism. We use the term organism, okay, instead of
Yeah, yeah.
organization. So let me give you a couple anecdotal instances from Africa and one's for Botswana again. So this may sound kind of silly to some people, but one of the ways I always was able to fit in and understand people quickly in Africa is a phenomenon known as the small house. Now, if there's anybody from Africa listening, especially Southern Africa, know what I'm talking about, the small house. Informal relationships with, this is men, informal relations with a female partner that's not your spouse. These are people who are married who have a girlfriend, but they're not a girlfriend. These are long-term relationships. They oftentimes have kids with these women and also are married. This is prevalent in many African societies. It's not plural. It's not bigamy, but because they're not married. But in Southern Africa, it's called the small house. So informally, when guys are talking about the small house, it means you're not talking about your formal marriage, but your side piece, if you pardon the
Wow.
crass term. But it's very prevalent for people who have powerful and have money because they can afford to do this sorts of things. So if you know that term, I often broke the ice talking to soldiers because young soldiers, enlisted soldiers, they find it humorous if somebody understands a cultural phenomenon. So I talk to them like, listen, guys, when you go home, this is not for your small house. And they just they laugh. In different parts of Africa, it has a different name. In West Africa, in Francophone Africa, people say the deuxième bureau, which is the second office, deuxième bureau. But it also has a military connotation when I talk to soldiers because, as I mentioned earlier, staff positions, the one is administration, two is intelligence. The two is the second bureau in the French staff concept, so the deuxième bureau. So it's intelligence and it's also your side piece. So understanding that culture, and when I was in Uganda, it had a different term. And what I would do is I had a driver at the embassy frequently, and I asked my driver, I said, hey, what do you guys call this? Because I know it's a phenomenon. And then at the appropriate time, the appropriate place, you don't do it it's not at a formal event. You just kind of relate to people and they get it. Okay, you're getting us. You understand. You're not making fun of us. You're understanding our culture. So that's something. Now, here's something that comes into play with Botswana. When I arrived in Botswana, the government of Botswana had decided finally to put women in the military. It had been an all-male force up until 2007, 2008 timeframe. And they dictated they'd bring the women in. Well, they weren't prepared to do it. So they sent them to Tanzania to a brutal training course. The Tanzanians agreed to do it for them. And they spent a year there. And then they came back and we had 23 female officers. They were all commissioned lieutenants. They had just arrived back from Tanzania when I got there. So I had Martha McSally. You might know her name. She ran for the Senate in Arizona. She's the first female combat fighter pilot in U.S. history. Flew A-10s.
Wow.
So she was at U.S. Africa Command. So she's also the person that filed a lawsuit against U.S. Air Force because they were forcing her to wear the hijab when she was stationed in Saudi Arabia. So she never made general because of that. The Air Force won't forgive that sin. But she's a smart person. Not that I like her, dislike her. I'm just telling you who she is. So Martha McSally, I got her to come down and talk to these troops, and it inspired them because here's a full colonel who's a combat fighter pilot in U.S. military. But one of the developments I noticed, and this is why I went around the country, I felt the need to get her and also a Navy captain who was, captain being a full colonel equivalent, who was at our embassy in South Africa, a black woman who had started enlisted in the Navy and then became an officer, and she was a full colonel, a captain in the Navy. She was a naval attaché there. So she came up, we formed a team after talking to the Botswana Defense Force saying, hey, there's a problem here in your force. And the reason I saw there's a problem in the force is that this story circulated very quickly. So there was a female lieutenant assigned to the airbase, and she just arrived. She went there. She's in charge. She's lieutenant in charge of this administrative office. There's a regimental sergeant major, old, crusty, been in the military for 30 years, male. Now, he's coming from male-dominated society. When you go home at night, men rule the roost in your home. When you're in uniform, it's only been an all-male force. Well, suddenly there's female lieutenants, and they didn't know how to deal with this. There was no acculturation for the existing force. They just dumped these females there. and told the females how they're supposed to behave, but they didn't tell the troops how they're supposed to behave now that there are women in their ranks. And there was a small number of them. And all the women outranked 90% of the people in the military because they're
Wow.
enlisted. So he walks into her office and he talks to her and he tells her to get him a cup of coffee. Okay, now this is an enlisted member telling an officer to get him a cup of coffee. So I used that story when we went on this trip and traveled all around Botswana. We traveled to all the major bases in Botswana and talked about what it means for women to be in the military. And the questions we got, Jay, from Botswana about their own military. So we had this one soldier. It's not important who he was, but this soldier who was serious. He said, because the captain was talking, Patricia's name, I can't think of her last name. She was talking about, the responsibility of having kids when you're an officer. She said she has children, but she felt an obligation to the force and to the country not to knock the kids out one after the other. So she planned her births of her children a few years apart so that she could serve and not be a detriment and drag on the service. Very honorable of her to do that. And she had kids. And so she's talking about having children for female in the military. And then one of the soldiers says, and he had a pained expression on his face, and he kept putting his hand up, then pulling it back down. And finally said, Captain, I'll just call her Captain Pat because I can't remember her last name. Captain Pat, I think we have a question over here from this warrant officer. And I said, please ask your question. And you should have seen the look on his face because he didn't get this new culture that was being introduced in his force. I did get it, so I was trying to make the point. He said, I don't understand. How can women serve in the Army when every month for 1 week of the month they're incapacitated, they're bedridden, they bleed, they can't? And I'm like, oh my gosh. And she was puzzled. She didn't know what he's getting at. I said, Captain Pat, let me deal with this. Listen, Mr. So-and-so, women aren't incapacitated for a week every month. Maybe your partner or your spouse is, or maybe someone just doesn't want to be intimate with you at that time of the month. I said, but the point is that they're getting questions like that. So the thing about the coffee and what I told them, this is the point that brings all this together. We're going to wrap it up on that question. What I told these soldiers in the Botswana Defense Force is that, listen, you and I are in a professional military. The Botswana Defense Force is one of the most professional militaries in Africa, if not the world. You are professional soldiers. You're not rabble. You have a culture in the military. You do things a specific way. You get a mission, you address it, you rehearse, you execute the mission, you clean up the mess afterwards. You wash your equipment, you go home. But when you go home, you take that uniform off, you go home, your life is different with your family. You're in charge. You might not be in charge of work because you're a junior enlisted, you're a mechanic and there's someone else, your boss. You go home, you rule the roost. Guys, you have to understand that now there are women in the military. This female lieutenant here, she outranks everyone in this room except me and the captain here. The rest of you are outranked by her. And you have to show her respect. She's not a woman. And you should have seen the looks on their faces like, what do you mean she's not a woman? They didn't say it, but I'm like, she's not a woman. She's an officer. She's a commissioned officer in the Botswana Defense Force, and she carries the rank and responsibility that come with that. No matter what her sex is, it's irrelevant. And they started to get it. And that started a culture change, and it helped the women integrate into the Botswana Defense Force, which was frustrating to me because the Botswana Defense Force had talked about this for 15 years and finally was doing it, but had never prepared for the integration of women into the force. And of course, you can imagine there were fraternization issues. So when we talked with Martha McSally to the female officers, this was funny because the 23 officers there, one of them asked a question and the others were kind of giggling because they knew where it was going. And so she said, she wasn't asked for herself because one of the other officers was in a relationship with a person who'd just been designated to be her supervisor when she went to a unit. And so one of the officers said, so Colonel McSally, I mean, is it appropriate for people to work in units when their partner is their boss? And she didn't understand. I said, so we pulled it out and we found out that this female, who's perfectly fine to have a relationship with this other officer, but she was going to go work in a unit where she's a lieutenant, he's a captain, and she reports him. You can't be knocking boots with your boss. But I mean, that's something that now the other lieutenants, they got it. They were laughing they're like, you can't do this. But the one who was in question, she was identified. It was no big deal. But she said, yeah, it's me. She didn't get that she can't be sleeping with her boss. So it's okay for her to sleep with that person. That's her personal business. But she should have been assigned elsewhere was the point. And so this is a cultural thing that we had to inculcate and teach. And those norms and practices have found their way in the Botswana Defense Force, in part because Americans brought an alien culture in which we did things in a certain fashion, but we tied it to the professionalism in which we share the same thing. The Botswana Defense Force soldier and I share much more in common culturally at times than we do with our own family when we go home. And that was the point I made. So I think I get a little bit off track, but I think those anecdotal stories are really helpful about understanding culture and why it's so important.
For our listeners, you have Colonel Chris Wyatt on YouTube. What I'd love for them to go check it out. Why did you start it, and what are they going to experience when they subscribe? What are they looking for? What are they looking to learn? What's the predominant your predominant presence around content, and why should it matter to our listeners?
Well, you're going to go listen to a right-wing podcaster who works for the CIA. At least that's what people say about me. No.
Oh, that's what they say.
Oh, you have no idea what they say about me. It's comical. So what happened was this, Jay. I retired from active duty in 2019 after 36 and a half years in the Army, 34 in active duty, moved 26 times, spent 23 years overseas, multiple combat tours, and lived in like 16 foreign countries, something like that. It's crazy. Anyway, I had a plan to build a consultancy so that somebody would pay for me to go to Africa and I can make some money. That'd be nice, but also get US businesses to go into Africa. Because other than the big names like Caterpillar, John Deere, Ford, Microsoft, Google, you don't see American businesses in Africa. And I predicted several years ago, and I'm not alone, other people have come along with this too, but I certainly was ahead of the curve several years ago, back around 2012, something like that. I started talking about Africa's growth. By the year 2050, Africa will go from today 1.3, 1.4 billion people to 2.3, 2.5 billion people. And my own personal estimate is that there will be a consumer class with disposable income. Now, not the same disposable income as a Brit or a Japanese or an American might have, but disposable income. You meet all your life's needs, you take care of your basic needs, and then you have money to spend on iPods, on cars, on clothing. But my estimation is that there'll be 900 million consumer class in Africa by the year 2050. American businesses are foolhardy and not looking at that potential. And the reason they don't look at the potential is because they don't look at Africa in the context they should. I've talked about something, I shared this when we chatted previously in a phone call, what I've coined CQ, and that's corruption, chaos, and coup d'etat. These are the three things that people see. They see Africa as chaotic, they see as coups occurring all the time, and they see corruption. And that's something they don't want to get involved in. But it's not as simple as that. And I think people need to overcome that. But what happens is that, so I predict 900 million consumer class. So why isn't Verizon in Africa? Why isn't Comcast in Africa? They're not. They're missing the boat. Why isn't Carnival Cruise Lines looking 15 years down the future about where the cruise lines will be in Africa to take passengers to make money off that? They're not. So I started this consultancy to try to get that going. And, timing's everything. The COVID scam started just a couple months after I started doing my consultancy. As I was in Japan for the Rugby World Cup in 2019, I came home. My mother had cancer. I went to Ohio to see her, and then I came back and I made plans of what I'm going to do for my business. And I started out, and I actually booked a few gigs, and then no international travel. So I couldn't travel. So I said, what am I going to do? Well, I was walking every day to make sure I didn't become the size of a house, but slowing down my activity because I just got out of the Army and staying fit. So I did that. But I mean, you can only walk so much without getting bored and listening to people on the internet and podcasts. And so the idea dawned on me that, what I should do is make some videos for businesses in Africa or in America so they can see what I know about Africa. They see what they're
Wow.
getting if they hire me. So I had an existing YouTube channel which had 2 videos on it from Iceland when I went to Iceland about 20 years ago. And I had 2 subscribers. So I said, let me start doing it. I made a mistake. I should have made a business account, but I didn't, or a separate channel. So I started producing videos, and I went to LinkedIn where I had about 9,000 plus people that followed me on LinkedIn because while I was at active duty, I would read news in Africa and then post the article on LinkedIn and give some commentary analysis of it for free. And I built up an audience of about 9,900 people. So I went on LinkedIn and said, hey, I'm using my YouTube channel. If you guys want to check it out. And I started to grow. And in 5 months, I went from 2 to 23,000 subscribers. And what I was doing was talking about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, about the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, the African Union, counterterrorism, counterintelligence, trade, macroeconomic issues, culture, language, all these things. And then I got attacked by YouTube because they didn't like the fact that I factually reported what happened in Pennsylvania under our law, in which the governor and the Secretary of State and now governor, the Attorney General, then violated the law in 2020. They didn't like that, so they started targeting me. On January 6th, I was given my first warning, and then from then on, they attacked one video after another, falsely accusing me of violating community standards. I refuted most of it, but it ate up so much of my time, it was becoming counterproductive. And eventually, they gave me a strike. They wouldn't remove it. Next month, they gave me a strike, wouldn't remove it. So that the third month, they could remove my channel. And ironically, they removed my channel for a video that didn't exist. I had deleted it the previous month, and they said, well, it's on our servers. So they took my channel away and destroyed my business model there. My consultancy became a consultancy that really provided services to different government agencies, often through third parties. I've gone to speak to the forces at Fort Bragg and Fort Carson on behalf of defense contractors about how to do security assistance in foreign countries like in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, and also in Africa. I've taught for the Department of Commerce and taught through National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and I've done some one-offs like the police forces in Ghana and things like that. But it kind of, and also do some stuff for the Army War College for a vendor there. I teach general officers things, but it kind of turned into less about what I anticipated to be and more about the YouTube and independent journalism. I mean, I write for newspapers, and I appear as a guest on multiple radio programs and television programs. And I've also been a source for several newspapers in DC trying to understand Africa, including the Washington Examiner, among others. But this has turned into me being a journalist and using my YouTube channel to talk about the world. So I do a daily news program to get specifically to point, Jay, 7 days a week, unless I'm traveling or there's an event going on or there's rugby, because I do play-by-play and color commentary for rugby games on the weekend. So I did 3 games yesterday. It's quite exhausting. That's why we're doing this today. So I did one on Friday. And I do that as a labor of love. I mean, if someone offered me a gig on television being a rugby announcer, I'd jump at it, but I do it as a labor of love. But my news channel, I do it 7 days a week. So when we finish here today, I actually would be on right now doing news at this hour, but I'll just do my news a little bit later. I take a unique perspective. South Africa is important to me, but so is all of Africa and the world. And people always look at me as the Africa guy. But when I was at War College, they used to have meetings for the intelligence professionals, and I was never invited. The irony, I was the most experienced intelligence officer at the Army War College, but people saw me as a director of African Studies. Didn't realize I was also an intelligence professional until someone who was working there said, wait a second, aren't you an intel guy? I said, yeah. Why aren't you coming to meetings? I wasn't invited. I didn't know you had it. So then I got involved. And it's the same thing with Europe. You know, when I was doing a lot of consulting for Africa and then the Russian invasion, and it's Russia, 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 Russia all the time. Well, the irony is that most of these people talk about Russia have less experience with Russia and the Soviet Union than I do. I spent a third of my life fighting the Soviet Union in more ways than one and knowing about what's going on in Russia, but they see me as the Africa guy. So anyway, I start my news broadcast with news of South Africa. And what I do is I have multiple subscriptions to pay sites to get behind the paywall. I read news. And what I do is I eviscerate fake journalism. All right. I give people the news and I give my take on it, my analysis from my considerable background experience. Doesn't make me right. I am, but it doesn't make me right. See, I'm trying to be humble there. No, but so I read the news. And if what I often find in the news all over the world is op-ed on the news page. When you start using adjectives to describe things, you've gone from reporting news to doing op-ed. And I pull it apart and I explain what's going on here. I also give my take on the events. I do South African news. And then I move across the region of Southern Africa and all across Africa. Then I go around the world for breaking news that's happening, earthquakes, tsunamis, things like that, Fukushima, all that stuff. And on top of that, I anticipate where I see a problem coming. I was reporting on Myanmar when nobody was reporting on Myanmar and what was going on with the Rohingya, and then when the government overthrew the government of Aung San Suu Kyi, and so on. So I do that, and then I come all the way back. Europe gets in there. I mean, sometimes I report on South Tyrol. Nobody ever reports on that. I report on Finland, things, the Baltic states. And then eventually I work my way back to North America and the U.S., and I finish up my news program with the U.S. The news program usually runs 45 minutes to an hour, sometimes a little bit longer, sometimes shorter. And then I interact with my audience. That's every day, 7 days a week. And then I do prepared videos. But since January, I've been on a mission here because of the Trump administration, all the actions they're taking, the impact around the world. And so I have done, at this point, I think 450 live broadcast and prepared videos since January 1st. It's insane.
Wow.
Some days I'm doing 7 videos. And look, I'm not just some dude sitting around eating Cheetos, watching the NFL on the weekend. This takes considerable time and effort. I'm working 15, 18 hours a day to do this. And I'm still not a professional YouTuber. That's just one of my outlets. I mean, I still write. I still get published in South Africa and here in the States. So I've had to turn down a book offer someone made just because I don't have the time right now. So it's an academic book, so it's not like it's going to make me any money. So I can afford to do that. But I didn't create my YouTube channel to make money. I did it to inform the world. But the problem is that I entered this space when these companies had already achieved the mass that they needed to be profitable. So Instagram and Facebook and YouTube needed people like Tim Pool and Crowder and all these others back in the day, and PewDiePie and all these people to become big and make money. They didn't start censoring content that was legitimate content until around 2020. And that's when I entered the space. And when I had the temerity to honestly report the facts and give my analysis of it, well, that was beyond the pale for the people that ran these institutions or these corporations. And so they illegitimately, by the way, if I was rich, I would sue YouTube because they violated the terms of service. I didn't. And they harmed my business irreparably when they took my channel down. I created a second channel, and that's the channel I'm on now. But because of events this year, that's why I'm so busy. I've gone from 20,000 subscribers on December 31st to 65,000 subscribers today.
Wow.
I've gone from one day in January having just 1,000 views to I'm averaging over 200,000 views per day. And it's insane. But it's all because of what the Trump administration is doing. And people, I somehow overcame the algorithm and found a way to overcome that just by what I was covering. And so people found me and more people found me. And that's the thing. Success builds on success. Not that I'm successful, but growing the channel is success. And so the channel is growing every day. My original channel still exists. I appealed it. The first time they told me to get stuff, they said, no, you violated terms. I'm like, no, I didn't. The video's not there. They said, piss off. Then I asked for it 6 months later and said, oh, no, you waited too long. It's gone. Your channel isn't here. I said, that's nonsense. I know your servers are full of content. You don't delete anything. That's how you took my channel away in the first place. So they told me to screw off. So I waited. And then about 2 years later, Trump got his YouTube channel back in early 2023. I'm like, wow. So I
Wow.
appealed it one more time. I said, listen, and I wrote a straight email to him. I said, listen, I acted in good faith. I produced videos that didn't violate your community standards. You changed them. And I removed the videos that might run afoul of them, even though they didn't. And then you removed my channel. I said, you acted in bad faith. I respectfully asked you to restore my channel. And next thing I know, the next day I'm looking at my email account and suddenly I'm getting emails about YouTube, which was tied to that channel. And I hadn't got that in 2 years. And I went and looked, my channel was back. But it's heavily censored. They shadow ban it. They unsubscribe people. They don't promote my content. I can put the same video on my YouTube channel and get 150 views, put it on my other channel, which is global, and get 50,000 views. There's something odd going on there. So anyway, but you can find me on YouTube at Colonel Chris Wyatt, all one word. And you can also find me. I took a page out of Donald Trump at Real Chris Wyatt. My original channel, while I was in the gulag for those 2 years, that's when YouTube allowed you to create your own moniker for your channel, like, at Real Donald Trump. Well, I want to go at Real Chris Wyatt, or at Chris Wyatt, but someone had already taken Chris Wyatt when I was in the gulag. So when I came back, I had to do something. So it's at Colonel Chris Wyatt and at Real Chris Wyatt. But I'll be honest with you, most of my content appears on the Colonel channel right now because that's where all the energy is going right now with this refugee program, with all the executive orders from Trump. And so you can also find me on Twitter. I'm at WMW Chris. But Twitter is a cesspool. It used to be a cesspool of leftist abusive people. Now it's a cesspool of leftist and rightist abusive people. So everybody's an equal opportunity abuser. But it is a great source for breaking news. When something
Mm.
happens in the world, people have a phone, they pull their phone out, they start recording, and they load up on Twitter. So I find it to be very useful from that standpoint, and that's why I use Twitter. But getting in conversations with people on Twitter is just it's bad for your health. So it's best just get some news from there and then go look at actual news sources. And so I'm on other social media, but that's the main ones right now, and that's kind of what I do. You can also catch me on some other programs, but like this one.
It's been an honor to introduce you to our audience. I hope we can do this again very soon. We didn't get into strategy as much as I would hope, but I wanted the audience to get to know you as a person and start getting inside of your great mind. If you're listening to this, follow Colonel Chris Wyatt on YouTube. I've been watching some of the videos, especially in preparation for this, and you don't lack passion or insights, and that's easy to take away just listening. If anyone's been listening to this, and then yeah, this has been a lot of fun and really helped me think about things I otherwise wouldn't be thinking about, Colonel.
Well, Jay, thanks. It's been a real pleasure coming on your program. People speak quite well of it, so congratulations to you for that. And I appreciate being invited on as a guest. We did talk quite a bit today. Look, just if you want to talk again, just ask me. As long as I could carve the time out, I'm happy to do it. I always tell people I speak to anybody as long as they're not a racist. You're not a racist. I'm not a racist. So I'm happy to talk to you. Those people are small-minded. I don't have time for them. But we're happy to talk about geopolitics or strategy, which is critical for businesses. So I'm happy to do that in the future. But yeah, I look forward to our next conversation, and I wish you well. And we're just around the corner. It's a few weeks away, and I may be traveling then. So I want to wish you a happy Easter.
Thank you. And if you're listening to this, share this with a friend that you believe needs to take a closer look at things in the world. And we will see you next time on the Culture Matters podcast.